Hey, it's Jack from Jack Gately Real Estate and the Online Real Estate Academy. So we have some new news. New news? Is that how you say it? From the National Association of Realtors. We have their letter from today. It just came out this afternoon, a couple hours ago. We are writing to share that we have updated our frequently asked questions to include additional information and clarity about written buyer agreements. So as most of you know, as part of the landmark bombshell commission lawsuit settlement or proposed settlement, one of the things that you're going to have to do is have a written agreement with your buyer. And these guidelines here kind of lay out how that's going to work. If you're a member of the National Association, you should have got an email from Katie this afternoon. She doesn't even use her phone name. You're supposed to know. From Katie this afternoon, which, as you know, I'm not a NAR member, but I had somebody leak it to me. Thank you very much. You know who you are, and appreciate the heads up. If you're, how should I say this, part of an MLS that is broker owned, but not NAR owned. And so that would be me, for instance, here in beautiful Massachusetts. We have MLS PIN, which covers about 80% of the state. And that is broker owned. And most of the broker owned MLSs adopt rules which are the same or similar. So even if you're not at a Realtor MLS, this will probably apply to you. But of course, check with your local MLS to be sure. So we're going to go through these frequently asked questions and talk a little bit about this new procedure. Just as a caveat, before we do that, I want to remind you that I am not fully convinced that the settlement is a done deal. I know everyone thinks it's on the freight train and it's done, but we still haven't heard from the Department of Justice. There's no rule that we have to hear from the Department of Justice, but I think we will. There seems to be this massive assumption that the Department of Justice has unofficially signed off on that. I don't buy that. But, we stand by and we will keep you posted should that or should that not arrive. I'll also mention, I posted this in my previous stream a couple of last week sometime, that I do believe that this is a game of whack-a-mole and that effectively these mandatory buyer agency agreements are effectively going to accomplish the same thing that the association was found guilty of in the lawsuit, which is effectively to inflate commissions, right? So I just think this is a different way of going about it. And I think should this scheme, and I do mean that in a derogatory sense, should this scheme hold up and be the new rules, I do think that this will basically perpetuate the same practices that we've seen before. But let's set that aside and talk about these new NAR requirements. So here we are here. If we were to slide down, let's take the first one here. The practice change requiring written agreements with buyers is triggered by two conditions. It applies to MLS participants, quote, working with buyers, and is triggered by, quote, touring a home. What does it mean to be working with the buyer? The working with language is intended to distinguish MLS participants who provide brokerage services to a buyer, such as identifying potential properties, arranging for a tour, performing or facilitating negotiations on behalf of the buyer, presenting offers by the buyer or other services for the buyer from MLS participants. So if for some reason or not you're a realtor, but for whatever reason you're not an MLS member, maybe you're in commercial real estate or something, this would not apply to you. It only applies to people that are realtors and MLS participants. And of course, as we said, the caveat, if this ever actually gets adopted. But let's just assume it's going to get adopted for the purpose of this video. If the MLS participant is working only as an agent or sub-agent of the seller, then they're not an agent of the buyer, so this does not apply. It does apply to dual agents, however. How will state laws affect the implementation of this practice? Well, obviously, if the state law precludes it, then you can't do it, right? Okay, so that's pretty simple. What does this mean? I think this is the meat of the situation here. What does it mean to tour a home? Written buyer agreements are required before a buyer tours a home for sale listed on the MLS. So for some reason, if it's some type of allowable office exclusive, it hasn't hit the MLS or something yet, you wouldn't need it in that case. Only on the MLS. Touring a home means when the buyer enters the house. My kid has some colored pencils. I actually use some colored pencils to highlight this because it's very wordy. Touring the home means when the buyer enters the house or the agent enters the house or provides a live virtual tour when the buyer's not physically present. So I think a lot of you have been doing this. I think I've done it a couple of times where you do what do they call it? FaceTime, right? So if you do a FaceTime for the client and you've entered the house to do the FaceTime, that constitutes a tour. Now, if you're just making a video for the general public or something, that does not constitute a tour. All right. At least is the way I read it. A home means, well, we know what a home means. Come on. Next question. Oh, hold on. Dropped my notes. Oh my God. The next thing is, does this requirement for a written agreement with buyers mean that MLS participants and buyers must enter into a written agency agreement? This is an important nuance. And the answer is no. MLS participants and buyers will still be able to enter into any type of professional relationship permitted by law. So you don't actually have to enter into a buyer agency agreement. You have to enter into some type of buyer contract agreement. I don't know what they want to call it. NAR policy does not dictate what type of relationship the professional has with the potential buyer, the term of that agreement, the services to be provided, or the compensation to be charged. Well, that kind of opens up a lot of potential free market opportunities there, as far as I'm concerned. That's very, very interesting. Let me see that again. Does the requirement for a written agreement with the buyers mean that the MLS participants and buyers must enter into a written agency agreement? The answer is no. MLS participants and buyers will still be able to enter into any type of professional relationship permitted by law. Oh, that we're going to have to think about. That opens up some opportunities, I think. If an MLS participant hosts an open house, like on behalf of the seller, because you're the seller agent, to an unrepresented buyer, will they be required to enter into a written agreement with those buyers? No. Can you imagine if the answer was yes? Talk about awkward. It's already going to be awkward. It's already going to be awkward. I don't know if that was my answer back. Like, now before you actually show somebody a house, you're going to have them sign a contract of some type, even if it's like a day-long contract. They're going to have to sign some piece of paper, which, yeah, that's awkward as far as I'm concerned. That's not the way you want to start off your relationship with your client. Hey, before we go out and show some houses, sign this. Oh boy. Yeah, some people are going to lose clients over that for sure, because they're not going to be good at it, or they're going to have agents who have never heard, buyers that have never heard. I've never heard of that. I'd have to sign something in order for you to show me a house. Nope. Go show me the house. Yeah, I'll sign things later if I like the house. Yeah, you can see where that's going, right? All right. Next up, are written buyer agreements required when listing agents talk with a buyer on behalf of the seller only? No. Are written buyer agreements required when MLS participants perform ministerial acts? Yes. So ministerial acts would be like negotiation. Now, there is a loophole for this. But MLS participants performing only ministerial acts without expectation of being paid for those acts, and who has not taken the buyer on the tour of a home, is not working for the buyer. So I don't know how many of you conduct ministerial acts on behalf of your clients, but don't expect to get paid. So this is kind of like a loophole, which at least upon first reading has no meaning for me. Are written buyer agent agreements required in a dual agency? Yes. Some states don't have dual agency, but we do here in Massachusetts, but not every state has dual agency. Are they required in designated agency? Yes. And again, we have designated agency here in beautiful Massachusetts. I'm not sure about where your state is. Consult your local listings. MLS participants may not receive compensation. This one's kind of tricky. For services from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to in the buyer agreement. Does this mean brokerage can only have one agreement with the buyer? Oh, this is tricky, isn't it? And the answer is no, which of course means the inverse is true. You're allowed to have more than one written agreement with the buyer. Well, that makes things tricky. What type of relationship the professional has with the potential buyer is not part of our. We already covered all these things. They don't regulate the type of relationship, the term, the services, or the compensation. Compensation continues to be negotiable. In the buyer agency agreement, can buyers and buyer brokers agree to a range? NAR policy will not dictate compensation. However, you cannot have open-ended or objectively, you cannot have open-ended compensation. And your compensation must be objectively ascertainable. Let me say that again. You cannot have open-ended compensation, and the compensation must be objectively ascertainable. Okay, that makes sense. So like 2% of the net sales price, would that be objectively ascertainable? I think so. It doesn't say that you have to list the actual dollar amount that's being paid, but it has to be ascertainable. And obviously, if it's 2% of the net sales price, then all you got to do is find out the net sales price, 2% of 500,000. You do the math. What is that? 10 grand, I think. Someone do the math for me. Having a good time with today's live stream. I would love your questions, by the way. If anybody wants to type in a question, I love that. That would be awesome. Now this comes to be some housekeeping questions here. There's a series of questions about whether you need to amend your existing buyer agreements. Should they transpires? No, that's not the word. Should they transcend the effective date of this policy? That's what I wanted to say. And I believe the proposed effective date of this policy is July 1st. And so if you have a buyer agreement that is still going to be in effect sometime this summer, you're going to want to amend it. To comply with these rules. We're not going to go over the rules again, but you're going to want to amend any existing buyer agency agreements should they exist after July 1st. That could be a pain in the tuchus. Can buyer and buyer agents rely on an offer of compensation that was on the MLS prior to the effective date? Ooh, this is a really interesting question. If the sales contract is signed before the MLS policy change, the buyer broker should be able to rely upon. I would much rather have seen will be able to rely upon the offer of compensation, even if closing occurs after the date of the policy change. So what they're saying is, let's just say that you put an offer in and it gets accepted June 15th, and it's 2.5% to the buyer agent. But of course, you're not going to close until like late July. Are you still guaranteed to get the 2.5%? And they're saying the buyer broker should be able to rely upon that. That seems like a thin read, right? I would think that you'd want to have that in writing, maybe off MLS if it's me. But if the sales contract is not signed before the date, then good luck with that. So, yeah, you want to have it. Yeah, it depends upon the effective date and when you actually sign the sales contract or the buyers and sellers signed it. Even then, I think in order to protect your agency, I think you're going to want to have some language in there as this date approaches or does not approach, as I do believe this is somewhat of a fluid situation, even though everyone seems to think it's not. But let's just stipulate that it is set in stone, coming down on a tablet. Not that I believe that, but let's just stipulate. And I think it would be better to have language in your contracts for anything that's going to, like, close in, transcend the, go over the deadline. You know what I mean? Yeah, be very careful about that. Should active listing agreements entered into the MLS before the MLS policy change be amended to address the settlement agreement's prohibition on offers of compensation communicated by the MLS? Okay, so if your current listing agreement makes specific reference to an MLS system, like in my case, MLS PIN, and it makes specific reference to sharing the compensation information on your MLS network, whether it's Bright MLS or MLS PIN or whatever, you might want to delete the specific reference. If the listing agreement instructs the listing broker to make an offer of compensation without reference to MLS, no change to the agreement is needed. But if the listing agreement specifies that offers of compensation be made on the MLS, then the listing broker should work with the seller to amend the listing agreement before the MLS policy change is implemented. All right, so we have a, how do I want to say this? Compliance nightmare coming up, right? And remember, if you're a NAR member, then you got a lot of work ahead of you. You got a lot of work ahead of you. And even if you're not a NAR member, you're probably an MLS member that is going to have to live with these rules or something very similar to it. So you might start to think strategically about how to comply with this general outline. And you know how I feel about debt mandate. You know how I feel about mandates. I'm not a big fan of mandates, especially for buyer agent agreements. But let's just say that that's the way it's going to be. Having said that, if this is going to be the new rules package, I'll live with whatever rules package there is. But if you're the broker at your agency, you're going to have to try to see, there's a try to kind of line things up so that you don't get in trouble with the realtor. I'm guessing that there will be some forgiveness. I hope that there's some, I'm not a NAR member, so I don't have to worry about this, but if you're a NAR member, I would hope there would be some type of enlightened enforcement for the first period of time, so that if you screw it up, you don't get some type of professional discipline over at NAR. And I would hope that the MLS that I'm a member of would also look at it that way. There's got to be a learning curve for a lot of agents and agencies. So I hope that occurs. However, you should at least start to put some significant thought into complying with the rules as soon as you can. On the other hand, you do run the risk, although a lot of people think this is minor at this point. I don't. You could run the risk that this does not end up to be the rules package, right? And so that's possible too. Let's see if we have any comments here. We have an "oh no" from our friend Sharon. How are you, Sharon? Good afternoon. And I think, Sharon, if I had to guess, you're saying, oh no, that you're going to need to have some type of written agreement. The big takeaway from this, which we already knew, is that you're going to have some type of written agreement just to show a house. So, for instance, on Saturday, this past Saturday, I met with a client, and it's actually a student at my real estate school, by the way. onlinerealestateacademy.com. Met with a client, and technically, if this was after July 1st, I think that's the effective date, I would have had to have a written agreement with him before we stepped into that house Saturday at 12:30. I don't know about you, but I mean, that guy he's somebody that already knows and likes me. He's taking my real estate school. Well, I mean, come on, to be fair, who does not know and like me? But what I'm trying to say is he's not a stranger to me. He knows me. It's not a cold lead on the internet where it just happened that somebody called me from Zillow or something like that. Not that I advertise on Zillow. We have some type of existing relationship, even though we actually never seen each other in person before. It's been virtual, but you get the idea. But what if it's completely cold? How do you meet somebody on the curb and say, hey, you know what? Before we step into this house, I have to have you sign this. Man. Now, we have a relationship disclosure, which is mandatory here in Massachusetts. But at the very bottom of the page, it also says consumer declined to sign this notice. So all you got to do is check the box. So it's really not mandatory when you read the fine print. But this is going to be mandatory. This is going to be mandatory. And I think eventually some, especially realtor agents, are going to be, caught up in some type of enforcement action. I don't know how MLS PIN will enforce this. How is this going to be enforced? Especially for broker-owned MLSs. What a nightmare. I wouldn't want to be those people to have to kind of enforce this. All right, we have a new question here. Cold but brutal negotiation. Well, I guess what you're going to have to do is educate them before you meet them on the curb, right? If you get some type of lead for, I don't care what it is, but somebody calls you off your billboard or whatever. So, I guess that would be a little bit better. But let's just say they call you off your billboard or your shopping cart advertisement or whatever. You then have to explain, oh, you want to see that house Saturday at 12:30? Oh, by the way, I have to send you over. I'm going to have to get your e-signature on something before we go into the house. No, don't go into the house. Stop. Don't go in. Imagine how awkward that could be. Hey, Sally, so nice to see you today. By the way, I noticed you didn't respond to my e-signature. Could you just sign this right here on the curb? Let me get the clipboard out. And jamming it down her throat. Don't go in the house before you sign it. Can you imagine how awkward that's going to be? All right. So any other questions? Yeah, clear as mud, but it's going to be a transition. We'll get through it together, and I'll try to keep you posted. Thanks for watching. All right. Have a great day. Bye-bye.